Hey guys, it's Chris. From a man who faked his own funeral to the Cambodian Zombie who scared away his mourners, here are 10 amazing people who went to their own funerals. Number 10. Timothy Dexter. This is one of the most bizarre and eccentric people to have ever lived, and his story is legendary. He kept making horrible business decisions that ended up working out for him in kind of strange ways. Timothy Dexter was born in the winter of 1748 to a family of farmers and struggled most of his life to make a name for himself. But Timothy was determined. He left home at an early age and lived in Boston, apprenticing at a leather dresser. Then Timothy tried to be a leather dresser himself. Didn't quite work out. And when Timothy met a woman named Elizabeth Frothingham, the couple married. She was quite wealthy. They moved into a rich neighborhood where one of their neighbors was the famous John Hancock. Timothy wanted to be as rich as his neighbors, but they hated him and saw him as low-bred trash. They tried to swindle him out of his money by persuading Timothy to invest in a new trend, continental dollar bills. They thought that those would become worthless after the American Revolution failed, but it didn't fail. It succeeded, and the currency became quite valuable. Well, Timothy invested all of his money in this new type of currency, and it made him a stinking rich millionaire. The wealthy elites were not pleased with this at all, and Timothy just kept using his money to make huge investments and profit. His neighbors despised him, and the only friends he had only wanted him for his money. Later, he sent wool mittens there, but those also sold for a premium because other merchants bought them and took them to Siberia. He even sold coal to the port of Newcastle where they mine coal. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but he had the good fortune to sell the coal during a coal miners' strike, and it made him even more money. And then there came the funeral. Timothy wanted to stage his own funeral to see what people truly thought of him. He convinced his wife and children to take part. Over 3,000 people came to his funeral, including Timothy. But after the funeral, Timothy was caught beating his wife with a cane because she hadn't cried enough and instead had laughed with the other guests. Timothy then passed away after his fake funeral at the age of 59. He was still very much disliked, but now he's legendary for his bizarre and wild investments and sales that all happened to work out and make him money. Number 9. Gilberto Adaujo. Gilberto Adaujo was working as a car washer in Brazil when his body was identified at the local morgue by his family. This happened in a small town about 70 miles from the border of Salvador. A car washer had been murdered on the weekend, and the police called Gilberto's family to see if they could identify the body. Well, they did identify the body, only it wasn't the right one. Police Inspector Roberto Lima later said that the mix-up was totally understandable. Seeing as both men were around the same age, each worked as a car washer, and they looked strikingly similar. Still, they didn't know that the mistake had been made right away. Gilberto didn't even know that everyone thought he was dead until a friend of his found him in the street and told him that his family was heading off to his funeral. He had, of course, tried to phone his family, but they ignored the phone call because they thought it was a prank. The only thing Gilberto could do was turn up to his own funeral in person, which he did. Gilberto arrived at his funeral, and his unexpected appearance caused his friends and family to freak out. Some panicked, and still others ran away. But in the end, everyone was happy to have Gilberto back to life. Number 8. The Cambodian Zombie. A group of people attending a funeral in Cambodia fled in fear after a man turned up at his own wake. They basically thought this guy was a zombie. The 32-year-old Cambodian man had been suffering from an unidentified mental illness and had been missing for 5 days before a decomposed body was spotted in a nearby river. Authorities mistook the bloated corpse for the missing man, and his family set up a funeral. As you can imagine, when he walked into his cremation, people were pretty surprised to see him. In fact, the people were so surprised that almost everyone in attendance ran away because they thought he was a ghost. According to a statement from his own father, after he realized that his son was in fact real and still alive and not a ghost, he had to convince the villagers to return to the funeral to see it for themselves. As for the random corpse that was about to be buried, it was handed over to the authorities. What would you do if you were at a funeral and the person who was supposed to be buried showed up? Would you freak out? I mean, I would. Tell me what you think by writing a comment down below. Then remember to subscribe to World List if you haven't already for more exciting videos. Number 7. Zengjia. A student in China recently decided to rehearse her own funeral for the reason that she didn't want to miss out on such a festive event. Zengjia forked over a ton of money to create one of the most elaborate funeral services ever. She had flowers, photographers, and a large crowd of people ready to mourn her. But the strangest part is that the student was only 22 years old, way too young to be thinking about holding a funeral. According to Zeng herself, the experience somehow gave her a more positive outlook on life. She spent a full hour lying completely motionless inside of her coffin, pretending to be a corpse. She had even paid a professional makeup artist to make her look like a dead body. A man in a military uniform stood over her corpse to guard her, and her friends and family all took part in the elaborate ceremony. Number 6. Captain Thunderbolt. Frederick Ward was a robber from the late 1800s known as Captain Thunderbolt. He was also known as a gentleman robber because he gave away a lot of the money that he stole to needy locals. He was basically Robin Hood, with women even hanging red sheets out of their windows to let Ward know when they saw the law was around. But unfortunately, the police shot and killed Ward in 1870. At least that's the official story. The legend is that Ward actually escaped his criminal past in England, made it to California, and then ultimately settled in Canada, where he lived a quiet life until 1903. According to the descendants of Frederick Ward, the police had set out to kill him, but had instead accidentally shot and killed Ward's uncle, then covered the mistake up by saying they had killed the infamous robber Captain Thunderbolt. The police even held a funeral for Frederick Ward in which a tall woman dressed in black with her face hidden by a veil attended. This tall woman was believed to be Ward himself mourning his uncle at his own funeral. Number 5. The Premature Funeral. An elderly couple from Bosnia recently decided that they were going to attend their own funerals. It wasn't part of a joke or a hoax. They just wanted to have the joy of attending their own death ceremony before they actually died. The ceremony was held in a small northern village where there were speeches made about how the couple first fell in love. And then there was a traditional burial feast followed by a night of celebration, music, and dancing. According to what the couple told local reporters, they were keen on organizing a proper funeral for themselves before they died because they had no children and didn't want anyone else to pay for their burial. Now the burial is all paid for and all they need to do is crawl into their graves. Number 4. Body Id Mishap. On the 1st of November, family members and friends of a man named Ademir Jorges Gonçalves in Brazil identified his body as the victim of a deadly car crash. The family was devastated. They scheduled the funeral to take place the next day, which happened to be on the holiday known as the Day of the Dead. But what the man's family didn't expect was for him to walk into the funeral home while they were grieving. You see, the man who was supposed to be dead had actually spent the night drinking at a bar near the site of the crash and wasn't involved in the accident. Instead, the crash had involved a man from one town over. After Ademir surprised everyone at his funeral, the body was handed over to the proper family, though not before the sight of the dead man caused some of his family members to literally jump out of the windows of the funeral home because they thought he'd risen from the dead. According to the manager of the funeral home, he'd never witnessed such a dramatic scene in his 10 years of business. Number 3. The bungled hit. When Noella Rakundo went from Australia to Burundi, there had been 3 hired killers waiting to take her out in a hit. They'd been paid by her husband as contract hitmen. She had returned to Burundi after attending her stepmother's funeral, and her husband back in Australia thought it would be a brilliant idea to get rid of her while she was out of the country. Unfortunately for her husband, the hitmen were not thrilled about killing a mother and innocent woman. Instead, they spared her life, extorted extra money out of her husband, and then gave Noella a memory card with the recording of her husband discussing the attempted murder. When Noella returned to Australia, her husband was already holding her funeral. He had assumed that she was dead and went ahead with the funeral without even seeing a body. She surprised him by showing up to her own funeral, and it turned out to be quite an ugly surprise for the husband, who was later convicted in a court in Melbourne. According to the BBC, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison for incitement to murder. Number 2. Zengjia. A villager living in the east of China decided he would hold a funeral for himself just to see how many people really cared about him. Zengjia was 66 years old, he had no children, he wasn't married, and all he wanted was to know how many people would show up to his funeral to give him one last goodbye. He organized the whole charade, and at least 40 of his relatives and several hundred local villagers arrived to mourn for him. He then surprised everyone who came to his funeral by jumping out of a fake tomb and holding a pretend ceremony in which he married a dead woman. It was all incredibly theatrical, and it ended up costing the old man over $2,000 to put on the fake funeral. In the end, it turned out he was actually quite liked and everyone had a really good time. Number 1. A rude awakening. Walter Williams from Mississippi was pronounced dead at the age of 78. It was his second time. 2 weeks before being officially deceased, he was declared dead by the local county coroner, Dexter Howard. However, after the paperwork was all done and Walter was put inside of a body bag and transferred to a funeral home, the bag with Walter inside of it started to move. He was in the embalming room when his legs started kicking. He also started to breathe again. An ambulance was called and paramedics arrived to take Walter back to the hospital, where he was declared alive. Walter was even in such great shape that he was released from the hospital just a few days later, nearly escaping his own funeral. But unfortunately for Walter, he then died 2 weeks later, and this time for good. According to the exact same coroner who declared him dead the first time, it was due to natural causes. Would you ever host your own funeral? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit subscribe for more wild topics just like this one. See you next time.